I hate to break it to your audience. Foreigners don't pay duties. American importers do.
Is a trade deficit even important?
The vast majority of the stuff driving the U.S. trade deficit is good. And then Donald Trump came along and blew it all up.
Was that a mistake?
This is not a system you can just manage. Trade policy is not the cause of nor the solution to all of life's problems. Let's try something different.
Today on the We Can Solve This podcast, I talk with Scott Lincicome, a trade policy expert at the Cato Institute, to talk about, well, trade. Scott Lincicome is the Vice President of General Economics at the Cato Institute and is an expert on international trade, tariff policy, and global supply chains. Today I talk with him about how we're going to get out of this trade war we find ourselves in. The issue is that this is a hyper-centralized policy. It is managed by one man at the top of the executive branch. That can be a real big source of disappointment, of feeling like you're disconnected with politics, and that's going to be a challenge. Trade impacts all of us, and it impacts us in so many ways we don't fully have a grasp of. It's within everything that we own, everything that we have, particularly today in our modern age. If we can push forward a better narrative, we can have an impact on trade policy. That's what we're going to talk about today on We Can Solve This. Well, Scott, thank you for hopping on. I don't want to waste too much of time, so I want to jump into exactly the point of this podcast, which is like trying to figure out how we can actually impact the issues around us. I think a lot of people have this feeling of giving up and they want to destroy the system for a lot of reasons, particularly in that they don't feel like they can contribute to real issues that they see in front of you. Trade, obviously a massive issue. A lot of people may have not realized until it suddenly blows up in your face, but trade policy, you're an expert in trade policy. Why are you an expert in trade policy? What drew you to this?
Luck. This is, it's completely true. I was an intern at the Cato Institute in 1998. I'll age myself there, and actually thought I wanted to be in constitutional law. And so I just graduated from college and was planning to take a couple of years off and, do what college grads do, travel and maybe work a little bit and then head back to law school in a few years. I made some of my dad's homemade fudge for Christmas and gave it out to some coworkers just to say, hey, thanks for everything. And I happened to swing by the trade center because I had made some friends up there. And the guy running the place at the time heard that I was leaving and they actually needed a research assistant. So I'm packing up my desk back in the intern cave in Cato and I got a phone call asking if I wanted to come up and interview on the spot. Hour later, I had the job. Pretty wild stuff. And so I spent 3 years doing that and really took a shine to it. Trade is a great combination of law, economics, practical stuff, everything's everyday life, all these kind of cool things. And there are good guys and bad guys, at least if you have my worldview. Good guys are the free traders, bad guys are the protectionists. Particularly if you live in Washington and do this for a while, you realize that, the protectionists are basically corporations and unions that want to force the rest of us to pay more for goods and services via tariffs and other regulations. That's what they're doing. They're in DC to ask the government to impose these new taxes so that they can have jobs and profits and all that kind of stuff. And hey, good for them. But if you have my ideological and intellectual leanings, you that's a pretty clear black and white issue for you. You know what side you're going to be on, right? I also realized that there were actual jobs in trade law. Unlike constitutional law, there weren't a ton of jobs unless you're a perfect law student, clerk for a judge, and then go on. There were a good amount of well-paying, stable jobs out there. So with that in mind, I went back to law school and stepped foot on campus at UVA Law and knew immediately what I wanted to do. So a lot of the classes I took were worthless, but hey, you got to take them. And started, I was starting to work long before I even graduated. I used to drive from Charlottesville to DC and work for firms on my Thursdays and Fridays, where everybody else was drinking beer and playing softball and doing all those things. I was in the car or working. Now, granted, I drank beer and played softball just on Saturdays and Sundays, like a normal human, not like a UVA law student. It was good. It paid the bills. It set me up perfectly well, could provide for my family. But, after a while, corporate law is pretty soul crushing. You're working 24/7, 365. As a lawyer, you have clients. And so you do occasionally have to do or say things that you don't necessarily agree with at an ideological level, not illegal things, but sometimes clients actually want us to lobby the government for stuff, right? I mean, that's kind of how it works, right? So combine all of that together with the fact that I started working remotely in 2010, and I did not want to move back to Washington to work in an office. I really love, I'm sitting here now in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I did not want to go back and be a partner. So I kind of started looking for an escape hatch, and Cato was kind enough to welcome me back. And so I've been here since 2020. And I used to say I was semi-retired, but these days I actually am working more now than I was as a lawyer because it's just absolute chaos.
Wow. So when you talk about regulatory capture, you've seen the gift horse in the mouth. You've seen it. You know what it's like.
Yeah, I mean, I've actually often joked that the easiest way to make somebody a libertarian is to have them spend a month practicing anti-dumping law in front of the Department of Commerce. And they will, I mean, it's either, read an Ayn Rand novel or live it in the basement of the Commerce Department. Because, yeah, I mean, all it is, especially in anti-dumping, is a very captured regulatory entity that is created to slap tariffs on stuff, to slap anti-dumping duties on products via a law that has repeatedly been changed by politicians that are very close with protectionist groups, particularly the steel industry. So the law has been repeatedly changed to become even more protectionist. It's almost impossible to win. If you were on the side I was always on, which is normally on the U.S. importer side or the foreign exporter side, and so the free trade side of it, you're going to lose. You just are basically fighting for the lowest possible duty rate you can get. So if you can get 4%, you're like victory, right? And you tell your clients that. You say, look, when you start the process, very likely going to lose. Our goal for you is to minimize your duty rate. Wow. And so, yeah, I mean, you do that for a while. You also realize that the regulatory complexity itself is a trade barrier, because the minute these cases start, little importers, who, by the way, are on the hook for duties. Just, hate to break it to your audience. Foreigners don't pay duties. American importers do. So you have these small importers that are like, wait, now I owe how much and how does this work? And what do? Well, you either hire a lawyer, and that's very expensive, or you just stop buying from any company or country that's involved in these investigations, right? So it's also so complicated that nobody can understand it. These calculations, I mean, even I can't walk you through a dumping calculation. We had professional analysts whose only job was to manage massive spreadsheets that could, handle these dumping calculations. And you put it all together, and it is, you could not, I mean, it really is. It's like libertarian fanfic. I mean, you could not write a novel that captures all of this stuff better than what actually occurs. Again, I have ideological leanings toward this stuff, but I very much am not what I would call a philosophical libertarian. I did not grow up reading Hayek and Rand and, all this stuff. I didn't even like economics that much. I thought, I was pretty good at math, but I didn't really like it. It was only through, decades of seeing firsthand how this stuff works that I was like, I mean, look, you just got to blow it all up. I mean, this is not a system you can just manage. You always hear these very smart technocrats, usually from Yale, Harvard, or MIT. They have very fancy spreadsheets about how they're going to manage industrial policy projects and tariffs and other regulations. These things are going to be implemented by angels, and they are going to work perfectly via very rational actors at all levels of the process. And boom, I have engineered economic growth and the perfect distribution of industries between manufacturing and services and semiconductors and whatever. And like I said, spend a month doing dumping calculations, and you're like, yeah, that's not going to actually be how it works. And you see it time and time again, right? And we just went through this with the Inflation Reduction Act, because look, I don't begrudge these very smart people in universities around the country who said, these subsidies will reduce carbon emissions by so much. And look, I'm not gonna bash their math, but the systems really assume that very highly compensated professionals in Washington and elsewhere will see the opportunity to make a lot of money and to tailor their business practices to qualify for subsidies or tweak the system so that they have an advantage. And at the end of the day, the system will not generate the amazing gains that the model predicts. That the other thing that happens, of course, is that other actors in the system, bureaucrats and unions and others, they see an opportunity for bureaucrats, it's not profit, it's job security, potential future jobs, because, bureaucrats often go from the private sector to the bureaucracy and then back to the private sector. It's very a lucrative revolving door. And they will also try to affect the process. And then, of course, politicians, they want to get reelected. And they get reelected often by catering to the groups, as Matt Iglesias calls it, which there are groups on the Republican side too. It's not just on the left. And the groups will also capture the process. And so you end up with well-intentioned, I'm not gonna say this stuff is all just a giant vehicle for rent seeking. It can have good intentions, but it ends up being far less efficient, far more wasteful, and much more distortionary than what you'll get under a free market, which isn't going to be perfect. It's going to have misses. It's going to have big hits, but at least it's very self-correcting quite quickly. And in general, as we've seen over a century, the hits will far outnumber the misses. And in the kind of technocratic system, the misses outnumber the hits, and the misses tend to just hang around for not just weeks and months, but years and years, right? I mean, we have ethanol mandates that, require us to put corn into our fuel tanks. And why do we have that? Well, at one point, ethanol seemed like a smart way for the environment. And of course, corn farmers are very influential lobby. And so we started doing this, but we realized decades ago that corn ethanol at the very least, was not environmentally friendly, was bad for our cars, and produced all sorts of other distortions, carbon emissions. To produce ethanol generates a lot of carbon itself, right? So we realized this years ago, but we still have an ethanol mandate, and it's very hard to get rid of this stuff, right?
If you can describe the regulatory capture, the rent-seeking organizations out there, how on earth did we even develop a NAFTA? How did we have a century almost of there was some unilateral free trade here and there between nations and whatnot. After Smoot-Hawley, I know they kind of handed the powers up to the president. Was that a mistake? Obviously today it feels like a mistake, but was that a mistake for the last century?
It was reasonable at the time. Smoot-Hawley was a disaster, but it was not the first tariff disaster. Tariff policy in the 1800s and through the beginning of the 20th century was just a corrupt, distortionary boondoggle. Entire books have been written on this period, and modern interest group lobbying got its start in U.S. tariff policy, because tariff rates used to be set at the legislative level. And every time a tariff bill came up, it became just a protectionist buffet, especially after the income tax was instituted and tariffs no longer had to generate much revenue. They could be just totally protective, because, of course, a highly protective tariff that blocks imports doesn't raise a lot of money. It got worse. And so Smoot-Hawley was kind of just the final nail in the coffin. And so Congress thought it was being smart. They realized that legislators could not be trusted setting tariff rates, and that the president, having a national constituency, having a slate of economic advisors, having an interest in good foreign policy, was going to be more responsible. And then particularly after World War II, which was in small part caused by rival trading blocs like World War I, there's a lot of trade tensions buried in our wars back then. They're not the primary driver, but they were they kind of fueled these conflicts. And Smoot-Hawley and the Great Depression, they said, look, let's let the president go out and negotiate trade agreements to lower trade barriers, and we'll still have to approve them, but he's going to do some of the heavy lifting. And we still will occasionally need protective tariffs for various reasons, some legitimate, some not legitimate.
Or like vaccines, or, super critical
or
industries.
National security, right? So national security is a legitimate use of protectionism, even a free trader like me. National security,
absolutely.
Right? But so we're going to give him some limited tariff power in these areas, and because he's such a trustworthy guy with he's so responsible, he'll never abuse these things. And so over the years, the legislature gave the president a slew of tariff powers under this, at the time, reasonable assumption. And then Donald Trump came along and blew it all up. He found these vague laws. He said, I'll abuse the heck out of these things. And he has. And he's kept doing it this time around, much, to our market's chagrin. So how did we get better trade policy? Well, it really was trial and error. Basically, governments reluctantly embraced trade liberalization. There's this myth that a bunch of libertarian ideologues took over global trade policy in the 1950s or the 1990s during the hyper-globalization period. And they sat in a room in Davos and puppeteered globalization and foisted upon the working class.
Oh, you weren't there? You weren't in the room?
I wish, but no. I was like 15. But the reality is that trade liberalization was like, well, we've tried everything else, and it all really sucked. So let's try something different. And again, the specter of World War sat in the background. And they said, you know what? Discriminating against countries, forming rival trading blocs, protecting your domestic industry at the expense of your potential allies, that's a very bad thing from a geopolitical perspective. So we're gonna slowly lower tariffs. Again, we tried a bunch of protectionism industrial policy in the 70s and 80s. It was not successful. Japanese automotive quotas were insanely costly. They didn't work very well. Did not revive the big three automakers or the UAW, the United Auto Workers Union. So this was kind of, well, let's try these other things. So you got agreements like NAFTA, which were not pure free trade, but they were pretty good. And at the same time, trade agreements are very much political documents. And they're political documents in two ways. One is they understand the politics of trade and protectionism. Protectionism is successful because it generates very concentrated benefits for the protected groups. Steel workers, steel companies get a lot of money, and very diffuse costs for the rest of us. We each pay $5. So the steel unions and steel companies organize, they lobby, they work really hard to win that protection. And the rest of us, we don't even notice. We're rationally ignorant, so it's called. So trade agreements recognize that dynamic. And what do? Well, they try to balance it with other concentrated benefits. And those come from exporters seeking new market access abroad. So that's why we have a reciprocal system. Reciprocal system is very mercantilist. It's not libertarian economics. It is, we will only lower our trade barriers if you lower yours. But the system but the agreement itself checks each other's power. And what I mean by that is, if government officials decide to break the trade agreement, they lose the new market access they just got abroad. So the United States is in a trade agreement with Canada, and every trade's flowing freely. Our exporters are very happy. We break the trade agreement. Canada retaliates. Our exporters get very mad. They run to Washington and say, "What have you done? I can't sell soybeans anymore." Boom. That dynamic is powerful. So it's a way to balance competing political interests as much as it is about economics and geopolitics. Nobody understands that. It's political in the second way, though. You're inevitably going to get some stuff that free traders don't like. I mean, you're going to get onerous intellectual property rules for pharmaceuticals because the pharmaceutical guys lobby it. Or you're going to get certain carve-outs. So, we still have Buy American rules. We still have this thing called the Jones Act. We still have high tariffs on a few things that aren't ever phased out. But the net, the overall effect is a significant amount of freer commerce, and thus it's worth supporting. Again, I have to hold my nose by saying, yeah, we should do this. It's not perfect, but it's better than what we have now. Because what we have now is no free commerce. So it's better.
When we think about, like, how do we have an impact here? Is it really just because it's centralized under the president now? Is it just like we have to impact the social narrative about it? Because of the social narrative about it from several decades, I feel like has just gotten worse. Like, everybody hated NAFTA, everybody hates trade, everybody feels like we're getting ripped off. I don't even know what that really means in terms of what we're experiencing. But what is the narrative? What is the narrative that we're supposed to overcome?
Well, the narrative is that globalization is bad for the working class and bad for the everyday American, good for the elites and good for giant corporations. And honestly, there's very little truth to anything I just said. I mean, yes, Boeing gets more aircraft exports via a trade agreement, right? But globalization itself, free trade itself, is actually very pro-poor. We benefit as consumers, and poor consumers benefit the most from access to freely traded goods and services, because lower prices, poor people spend more on basic necessities. We also, though, benefit as small business owners. We benefit as workers. Most of us work in services that aren't, where you don't work as in the auto plants, right? So there are a dozen different ways that this narrative is false. Even in manufacturing, the narrative is false because most manufacturers today in the United States are global. They depend on imports of raw materials and parts and all that kind of stuff. They depend on export markets. So I think part of the way, and I should note, there's all these cultural aspects of globalization that are just awesome, right? Squid Game is an amazing show on Netflix, which is an American company, but you're probably going to be streaming the show on a device made in China or somewhere abroad, a device that's probably designed, though, by an American living in California. The profits of that go to shareholders that are probably my 401k, because I'm a very boring index fund guy. So, I mean, there's huge benefits to all this beyond just the little widget, and yet we myopically focus on just the widget itself, right? The streaming stick. So there's all these cool interconnected parts. I love food. Cuisine is another area where globalization rocks. And so, like, when I think about how do people change the narrative? Well, I think the more important thing is to open our eyes to the kind of miracles that we live with every day, many of which are due to the free flow of goods, services, ideas, people, and all these things, right? It is always amazing to me when people bang away on their iPhones at how terrible globalization is, when, the device, the network, that is globalization writ large, right? And I think that's the starting point, is simply recognizing how much of our lives are in a global economy, and how fun and great it is. Beyond that, this is a hard industry for, bottom up social change, because so much of the policy is set in Washington. But hey, it is important to, at the very least, document where all this protectionist nonsense is affecting your life. I mean, if you are, one of my colleagues at Cato, he has an e-bike, and the e-bikes retailer just sent him a notice that all the e-bikes they sell have just gone up by $500 because of tariffs, right? So just simply documenting that stuff and posting it on social media, talking about how suddenly your grocery store is not selling some produce item because the tariffs have made it too expensive. That kind of stuff, that can be useful.
No, that's absolutely huge. Documenting it, because one thing I was thinking about is that we naturally as consumers do a lot of substituting of goods. And so we don't actually experience necessarily the price of inflation because we do so much substitution. And then we can easily forget within 4 years or reinterpret the past in a way that's like, oh, actually, I didn't feel inflation, or I felt more inflation than I thought because I heard the news or whatnot. And documenting it can actually, ground it and anchor it in reality, yeah?
Real life stories like this resonate better than charts. I wish charts and graphs resonated, but the reality is that these types of things are where, especially given how, everything is social media and TikTok and all this kind of stuff, that's, I think, how you make it click for people. Whether by noting, wow, how amazing is it that I have access to all these cool things that are totally the result of globalization, or, man, how much does it suck that the government is now taking this away and is making, remember, I used to have 10 choices for this, and now I have 6, right? I think cars is going to be something we're really that assuming all these automotive tariffs go through, you're going to see a dramatic reduction in the available types of cars. So really cheap cars are gone, because most of them are made abroad, and a 25% tariff is just going to be, what's the point, right? So, that kind of stuff, I think can be quite valuable for at least trying to show the world, and your followers and all of that, what's up.
That makes sense. I think, the previous episode was about housing, and that's a very local issue. The policies about housing affordability are all local, and that allows us to have a really strong cultural lobbying force of like, yeah, we're here on the grassroots, we're impacting it that way. And I think it's going to be impacted by trade because, the steel and the timber or whatnot is going to come from abroad. Is that a way that it can plug into our conversation about trade, these kind of localized communities that can plug into the issue, but at least they have the energy and grassroots and motion to talk about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the community angle is such that there are a lot of communities in the United States that very much depend on trade, but you never hear about them. You never hear about Laredo, Texas, that is entirely dependent on NAFTA. You never hear about West Point, Georgia, that from our videos, that has been resuscitated by a Kia automotive plant. You don't hear about port towns like, Charleston or Savannah that are, again, very much dependent on trade. And so many people work in trade. So those are the types of community stories that are valuable, pushing back, because there's this narrative that globalization has destroyed our communities. Well, look, undoubtedly, globalization, free trade, import competition has challenged some mill towns that were, towns that were dependent on one industry, and that industry shrinks because of trade competition. Now, it might shrink from a lot of other things too, but because of trade competition. So saying, hey, but there are also a lot of communities that benefit from this is also valuable.
I feel like a lot of people may still be a little unsatisfied with, there are good, cheap goods, right? We hear this a lot. Oh, the cheap goods, but what if a whole town has been devastated, right? You wrote about China shock. What is it that people really experience with trade? Like, yeah, okay, factories, GM closes a few factories here, for sure, that affects a lot of people. What are they supposed to see? What are they supposed to believe in if what you're saying is true regarding free trade being a benefit? What are they supposed to do now?
Well, it's a false choice between cheap stuff and jobs. The reality is that, yes, we get cheap stuff, but we also get jobs. And so there's a thing called the lump of labor fallacy, which is this idea that we all have just one job, we all work in that job, and any sort of disruption means that you're unemployed and that's the end of it. Well, that's not how it works in the real world. In the real world, people adjust. And especially over time, they move into better jobs. Just like I don't make my own clothes. We don't manufacture a lot of clothes in the United States. We do other things, higher value activities, mainly in services, and then we trade for those things from a place like Guatemala or Vietnam or whatever. And so the first thing is to reject the binary choice. And then the second thing is to note that the general trend for trade and globalization is moving up the economic ladder, not down the economic ladder. And that's really, really important. Trade is just one way of kind of expanding the economic pie. It actually expands economic growth, capacity, gives us more choice and all those kind of great things. And then finally, it's always critically important to note that free trade is about time. Again, going back to making your own clothes or growing your own food, because you don't do that, because you work in a higher value industry and you trade for those necessities, you actually end up working less. Because we don't all just work to work. We work to make money, and money that we then consume stuff. So once we hit a certain level of consumption, we stop working, right? So studies show that because of open trading environments, we have more free time. We have more leisure time. And then if we had autarky, we're a country that made everything, we would actually be working more. We would have fewer days off. So that's critically important too.
One last question, because I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but there's been so much talk about trade deficits, and I always thought trade deficits were a lame figure. It doesn't really seem to measure much. Is a trade deficit even important? Because if it doesn't measure services, if it doesn't measure, like, what does it mean? What's the point of a trade deficit when we talk about it? Trade deficit
is just importing more than you export, but it's not driven by trade policy. It's driven by these underlying savings and investment flows. It's very, very complicated.
So it's not bad to have a negative trade deficit?
No, it's not bad at all to have a trade deficit. Well, let me put it this way. The trade deficit is a symptom, not a disease. The symptom can be of good health or bad health. So it's always critical, if you see a trade surplus or a trade deficit, to look under the hood at what's driving it. The vast majority of the stuff driving the U.S. trade deficit is good, or not bad. It's nothing, right? We are a relatively young society. Relatively young societies spend more than they save. Places that spend more than they save run trade deficits. We are a great place to invest. So people in foreign countries like to invest. So they actually save more than they invest. They run trade surpluses. So there's all these types of stuff that has nothing to do with tariffs, nothing to do with trade policy, and again can be the symptom. You have to then look at the causes, and in the United States, most of the causes aren't a reason to get worked up. But it is an empirical question, not simply this is bad or good.
So what actually gets measured? If today we stream movies, the movie getting streamed onto my device, that doesn't get measured. But in the past, if a film reel came in through the port of Brooklyn, that would get measured in trade deficit, right?
I mean, that's another thing that drives me crazy, particularly right now when we're like applying tariffs based on trade balances, or that's what Trump wants to do with these reciprocal tariffs. Trade deficit numbers are really skewed because they don't include a lot of economic value. and they mask a lot of economic value. So they're reported, a real simple example is an iPhone comes into the United States as a $400 product from China, when in reality, iPhone contains stuff that's made all over the world. So if you were to look at our iPhone trade deficit, you would think, wow, we are losing in iPhone trade. And then you realize that actually a lot of that content came from Japan, a lot of the stuff from Korea, the United States. And oh, by the way, Apple is a US company, and thousands of Americans work in design and marketing and research and all this kind of amazing, cool jobs. And they benefit from those iPhone imports. So it turns out we actually win from this. And of course, Apple shareholders win too. So again, the best thing I can say is don't even bother with the trade deficit because it gets very complicated very quickly, and it's far more likely to confuse than to elucidate.
Wow. All this talk about trade deficits, I'm hearing it all over the TV, all over radio, and it's just a figure that it measures something, but that itself is just not really important to what. So what figure is important for us? What should we be looking at?
It's lame, but per capita gross domestic product.
No, Old Faithful, tried and true, absolutely.
Economic growth is not the end-all be-all, but it is closely correlated with all sorts of other things: living standards, infant mortality, happiness, you name it. So if you look at per capita gross domestic product, that's going to tell you a lot about how well an economy is doing. And guess what? The United States is right at the top. The only countries that have higher per capita GDP are going to be financial centers or petrostates, or it's going to be distorted figures. So that's a good one. Median working class wages are another good one. Those are up 40% since the 1990s, adjusting for the proper inflation. Not, some people like to mess with these numbers. But we also should always remember, and this will be the last thing I say, economics is not life in the sense that there's a lot of other things going on in the world, and trade policy is not the cause of nor the solution to all of life's problems. And anybody who says, oh, the culture is this, and people aren't having babies, and they're not getting married, or people are overdosing on drugs, and globalization is to blame, you need to just stop listening to them. Because the reality is that there are a lot of complex problems in the world and in the United States. The vast majority of those have nothing to do with economic policy. They can't be fixed by economic policy. They don't caused by economic policy. And people who claim to be these kind of snake oil salesmen are, well, just that.
Scott, thank you so much for breaking this down with me. I know I went way over time, but I hope the next time I talk to you, we will be living in a freer economy.
Fingers crossed.
And hopefully Duke wins, NCAA next time, huh?
I'm a UVA fan, so I'm fine.
All right, thank you so much, Scott. Take care, man.